Okay, it is 4 o'clock on the nose UK time, so I'm going to go ahead and get us started with our Spatial Analytics and Data launch panel on post-pandemic city futures. This is part of a year-long seminar series on spatial analytics and data, and I'd point you to the website for the full lineup, which is pretty exciting, including next week already Monica Kufer, who'll be talking. And the way we're going to run this panel is that we have 7 panelists who will give us a quick 2-minute rundown on their views on what they think will change post-pandemic and what they think will not change. We'll then give each panelist the opportunity, after they've spoken once, to redirect, sort of debate style, but to pick up any loose ends that they may not have been able to get to in the initial round, or perhaps interesting questions that other panelists have raised. Levi, Wolf, and I, who are the core organizers of this panel and this seminar series, we've also put together a few questions that we're just sort of curious about from our own perspectives. So we'll allow the panelists to respond to those. And then we're hoping that the audience will have contributed questions. And you can do that using the Q&A functionality here on this Zoom meeting, or on Twitter using the SAD2020 hashtag. And just in the interest of inclusion and diversity, we will aim to pull a range of questions from different types of audience members, but also to allow the panelists to each have a turn at responding to questions in their research areas. So if you've already asked a question and we don't get to you, again, please understand why. And without further ado, I'll get us started. I think. So our first panelist is Dan Immergluck. If you want to take it away, Dan.
All right. Thank you, Rachel. Thanks for inviting me, and good afternoon and good morning and good day to everyone. My answers to this question, and I think I win the contest for most boring slide. I've seen the other slides. My answers are pretty straightforward and definitely come from more of a US perspective. My answer to the first question is, there's been a lot of press in the paper here about suburbanization and exurbanization being prompted by the COVID crisis. And I think there's no evidence for that, other than perhaps some evidence in San Francisco and New York. And I'm not even convinced of that being kind of long-term. I think sprawl will continue in the US. It's been kind of picking up since the Great Recession as the economy recovered. And I think gentrification will also continue, especially in growing cities. The rent drops we've seen in some high-cost cities, I think, are probably temporary and maybe kind of corrections to very high prices, to very high rents. And then one thing that I think will change, I'm really not one to predict major changes in urban form. I've seen too many people be kind of ex post embarrassed by such predictions, people calling for the end of suburbs during the Great Recession as an example. I do expect there to be effects in the housing market, both on housing policy and the ownership structure of the rental market in the US, with these changes being very dependent on policy in the next 6 months, particularly in terms of what we do about rental assistance and whether really massive rental assistance is eventually adopted and deployed, which we don't seem to be able to do yet. And one big concern I have is that a great deal of our lower cost, really affordable properties are unsubsidized units, which currently house many lower income families. This often isn't the greatest housing quality, kind of housing of the greatest quality, but we do have evidence that rent rolls in this market segment have declined significantly, despite what the press has been reporting. And if massive rental assistance isn't forthcoming soon, I think we're going to see a lot of these units go two ways. One, be acquired by large investors, including private equity firms. And then in weak market neighborhoods, especially in urban neighborhoods, kind of slower growth metros, we're going to see we could see significant abandonment like we saw during the Great Recession in the single family market. Instead of seeing owner occupied homes scooped up by investors, though, I see more of a significant transfer ownership of multifamily and maybe switching ownership of single family rental to larger investors. So those are my two answers.
Thank you very much. And next we have Charlotta Melander.
Okay, thank you. So I would echo much of what we heard here from the first speaker, but so if we're talking about what's going to happen after COVID, I guess everything will just be speculations, because we honestly don't know, right? But I think the best way to predict this would be to look a bit at history, and it seems like quite little has happened in cities after pandemics in the past. It seems like we have a very short memory, and we still tend to go back to normal as soon as we possibly can. And I realize that I'm saying this sitting in Sweden, that obviously took another way than most of the world. But in the end, I don't think we were that different. We're still having restrictions. We're still not hanging out with our parents, etc., and we're keeping our distance. So why do I say that I don't think that there will be a big difference after COVID? Well, if we look at cities overall, and I stole this equation from Glaser, if someone recognizes it from Consumer City, where they puts it up so nicely that it's an urban productivity premium from agglomerations coming from cities that increase wages, in combination with this being close to one another amenity premium where we can hang out and have fun, that will sort of reflect what we pay in rents in the end in certain places. And we know from COVID right now, it's the urban amenity premium that sort of is hit in this equation, but we still have the first one to rely on. So even once the pandemic is over, we're still going to have stronger labor markets in bigger cities, which will attract people to come there. And in the end, as said, we will have forgotten about this pandemic more or less, and the urban amenity premium will come back too. And the reason why I think this will come sooner than what we think maybe is if we look at the graph up to the left, which I published some time ago together with my colleague Lina Bjerke, where we use Swedish microdata to look at who is migrating from one place to another. So on the y-axis is the number of migrations across a municipal border, which is more or less like a county in the US, and then the age group, at what age these people moved. And you can sort of see that the migration is clearly focused in the age group 18 to 35 years approximately. And in a sense, this is also the group that is hit the least maybe by the pandemic. It's not a risk group. They still want to have the access to the urban amenity premium. So I don't think we have any big reason to believe that they would change their behaviors when it comes to migrating. And I just added a little map of Sweden because I assumed that it will be kind of UK, US focused from other speakers. And this map, you can see a little red dot in that map if you look very closely, and that little red dot is Stockholm, the Stockholm municipality. And in that little red dot, when I made this map, you had almost 1 million in population, which is about as many as you have in the 111 yellow dots in this map combined. So in the little red dot, you had more than 5,000 people per square kilometer. In some of the yellow dots, 0.2 people per square kilometer. And even if we know that Stockholm was hit the hardest, in combination with the first graph, I still think the in-migration will continue both during the pandemic and also after. So I don't think we see the death of cities. So, but if I would briefly say what I think may change from the pandemic is that I think that certain processes that otherwise may have taken 5 years will now maybe take 2-3 months. People who have been going around thinking, should we maybe move to a rural area? Should we maybe relocate? I think a crisis like this can speed up that thought process and decision process so that we see things that will go much quicker and much faster over a certain time period. Just like I don't think any one of us believed that we would give all our lectures via Zoom or Teams. If someone would have said that a year ago, and suddenly we were there. In 2 months, we were up and running. So I think it will be a speed up of certain processes that will be the outcome of the pandemic. So that was pretty much my thoughts.
Thank you. Next, we have Harvey Miller.
Thanks, Rachel. I am a transportation geographer who studies sustainable mobility, and I'm also a cyclist, walker, and public transit user. So I thought I'd throw my mobility biases right out there so you can see where I'm coming from, not only from a scientific perspective, but a personal perspective. And so far, I agree with what I've heard so far is that there will still be cities. Cities are not going to fundamentally change. They've been through this before. We've had a major pandemic in history about once a century. And there were cities after the Black Death in the 14th century. Cities still existed. In fact, the Renaissance happened after the Black Death in the 14th century. So maybe that's something to look forward to. There were also cities after cholera in the 18th, 19th century. So this is just the latest pandemic. It may be different this time. We don't know. We live in a much more connected world, but I'm still doubtful that this is going to fundamentally change cities. Cities are simply too sticky to disappear. I mean, if you think about it, like Rome was sacked and lost its water supply in the 6th century. They had a 90% population decline, and now Rome is back. If you might have noticed, at least based on my last visit there. We also can drop atomic bombs on cities like we did in the middle 20th century, and those cities were both back within 3 decades in terms of population and economic activity. Cities have this magnetic scaling quality of the benefits, like innovation being superlinear, while the costs, such as infrastructure, are sublinear, and just makes urbanization very compelling. And there's also not as much to do in rural areas anymore, at least economically. So what will change? From a mobility perspective, I think we're going to see increasing polarization, both cars and bikes. Some people will choose cars because they want to protect themselves. But as you've noticed, biking is up. I mean, if you try to buy a bike in your city lately, you can't buy a bike in my city. They just flew off the shelves all summer. That's really great news. That creates bike demand for more biking. I think we'll see people retreating to single occupancy vehicles, but I think we'll still see mass transit because cars are financially stressful to many households. And we saw this after 2008, 2009 recession, the Great Recession. Public transit ridership in the United States went up because of some of the financial stresses. So we're going to see those countervailing tensions. I think we're also going to see a suburbanization. Some people will say, well, I want to be out with a lot of space and a big backyard and everything where I can just stay at home and cocoon. But I think a lot of people are going to say, well, I miss the human touch. It wasn't great being trapped out in the suburbs. I'm going to move to the city. In terms of activities, I also think it's going to be a complex mix of presence and telepresence. I think some will continue to work from home and a lot of other things from home, but we all miss the human touch. I think that's one thing we've all learned is that we miss people. So I think social processes will be organized, and this will determine the from home bit. It's not just a matter of technological substitution. Systems are too complicated. Human systems are way too complex. So this leads to the major question we have is, what are the implications for environmental, social, and economic sustainability? And it's unclear because cities are complex. The only thing that constrains us in cities are physics, biology, and technology. The rest is up to us. And although we can't predict the future, we can certainly push these complex urban systems towards different attractors. We know roughly what different infrastructure and policy levers do. For example, if you build highways, you get sprawl. The complexity bit is figuring out the details and cascades and mitigating them when you intervene in an urban environment. So it just depends on the choices that we make now, not only us as people, but what our city leaders make in terms of infrastructure and services. I do think COVID's an opportunity. As Rahm Emanuel famously said, never let a crisis go to waste. It's an opportunity to try new things. There's no question that humanity needed a pause in the 21st century and rethinking. So I'm hoping we use this as an opportunity to rethink how we approach cities and to make them more sustainable, equitable, and economically innovative. Thanks, Rachel.
Thank you. Okay, next up we have Max Nathan.
Hey, so I'm going to echo quite a lot of what's already been said. Something I think probably won't change. I mean, like Charlotta said, we're in a world of speculation here, but on the present evidence, it's unlikely this is the end of big cities, let alone the end of cities altogether. The last big supposed shock we had to urban systems, which is the kind of arrival of ICT, ended up strengthening urban cores rather than weakening them. So technology was a complement. It may be different this time. I mean, the technology is a lot better, and we're also in a forced experiment situation. So there's been a kind of massive nudge forward into thinking about new ways of working and new ways of organizing stuff. So as has been said, I think we're already seeing an acceleration of trends towards remote working, towards the kind of evolution of retail and leisure, towards the way that things like higher education are organized, and bits of the city like this old phone box may become obsolete in that process. And there is a geography to that. So the longer this goes on, and the kind of worse the public health response is, and that's going to vary by country, the more I think we're going to start to see shifts in the internal structure of big cities. So this may be the end of central business districts as we know them. Something I think will change and is already changing is our awareness of urban vulnerability and big city vulnerability, which is which we've just heard about, and that sits across a whole range of domains. So I've been thinking about this book by Mike Davis quite a lot recently. So it's published in 2005 and really wasn't taken seriously at the time. I think partly because it has a sort of chicken on the cover, but it's completely on the money in terms of the type of globalized pandemics that he saw coming, and that a number of parts of the world have already had. There's a notion of the post-pandemic city implies that COVID-19 is a one-off, and I don't think that's right. I think that parts of the world have sort of not seen this, and now everybody's seen it. And as we just heard, if you look back at the kind of long history of big cities and disease, I think many of us have kind of forgotten about that, due to various, bits of kind of public health progress in the last century. So I think this raises the importance of good public health systems. So in the UK, this is partly about test and trace systems that actually work, and that actually allow us to monitor how pandemics are spreading and to try and deal with them. But it's also about the importance of kind of broader urban adaptations to to infrastructure and to bits of the sort of economic and social domain. I mean, if we're lucky, we're going to end up with a set of new sort of frictions, which may be COVID related or maybe pandemic related in urban living. If we're unlucky, then we're going to have more lockdowns and more forced adaptation. And those are my thoughts to start.
Thank you. Okay, next up we have Sue Parnell.
Great. Hello, everybody. Talking to you from Bristol. I see we have people, it looks like, from everywhere in the world, which is wonderful. The photograph on the left is in fact Johannesburg, which is the city that I grew up in and was born in, and in fact did my PhD on. And as I was thinking about it, it is in fact the area of the city that I did my PhD on, looking at the rise of public health legislation and the genesis of segregation. And so my answer to the question of what is not going to change is basically we carry our past with us. The urban palimpsest, the way that the layers of the city have been laid down, eroded, overlain, allow us to change cities, but we never erase completely. So the idea that we face a kind of a utopian opportunity, a de novo kind of post-COVID reality for cities, I think we really have to put aside. And what we need to do is we need to understand very specifically the kinds of patterns of infrastructure, of inequality, of governance that are embedded in what we think about as our cities. And I think of that as the palimpsest, that kind of archival document that is the living reality of the city. And that's not going to change. We will change it, which takes us to the second part of the question, which is kind of, for me, as much about kind of how do we change it as opposed to that we want to aspire to change it. And of course, ideas are crucial to that, which is why we're having this seminar, why there are a number of people talking about what should the post-COVID city look like. But we want to be careful when we think about that, because we don't only want to be aspirational in our ideas, we also want to be able to think about questions like what kinds of data for people in this sort of seminar, and what kinds of institutions, and what kinds of politics, and what kinds of values might those be? And I do think that those will change, not necessarily in a linear way. And we may come back, as a number of people have already alluded to re-embracing the idea that health and the urban are inseparable and need to be much more closely aligned. And I think that paradigmatically is very different from a space where we think that data scientists rule the world or that planners rule the world, where we have a much kind of more nuanced understanding that there are complex drivers of the city. So I think we've got to come back to that. So ideas. And when ideas change, generally practices change. And those practices in city contexts are often extremely boring. They're regulations, they're building codes, so when Harvey talks about transportation, sometimes it's the red book on transport that changes. So the pavement width doubles so that we can actually have restaurants outside, or we no longer have to have curb zones of a particular height so that bicycles can go up and down. So I think the regulations will change, not tomorrow, but over time in response to an evolving understanding of the city. And similarly, I think that the planning and development priorities will change. And part of why I think that is the case is that there's already been a push for that. The sort of 21st century has had a lot of pushes, particularly around climate change, but to a lesser extent around biodiversity. And I think what the pandemic does is that it galvanizes this idea that actually we have to make choices, and that planners actually are influential in shaping and directing some of those interventions, whether that's spatially or in terms of form and function. So I think that will shift. And associated with that, and perhaps I don't know which is the tail and which is the dog here, but investment patterns have to shift. Now in the short term, that's just going to be that there's less money. Now, less money in a city isn't always a bad thing. It is in some cities, particularly in Africa, which is a lot of where I work. And so the fact that the possible investment of billions of dollars of pension money in the continent that really needs it for the cities that are to be built has probably just evaporated for another decade is really very serious, because it's happening at a moment of massive urbanization. And so we want to be thinking about that, plus the fact that there's going to be a pullback to invest in the already quite well-built cities of Europe and North America and China, actually again kind of points up that real kind of difficulty of investment patterns and understanding what that is. And then finally, and I think a number of people have spoken about this, I think that there will be changes in urban practices. And perhaps throughout the rest of the seminar, we'll pick up on various of those. So I won't go into what I think those are going to be at this stage. So thanks, Rachel.
Thank you. Next, we have Ariana Planey.
I didn't realize I could fix up the slide. So for the first question, one thing I believe will not change is the persistence of social, spatial, and economic inequity in cities. And more broadly, my observation has been that the pandemic has been a backdrop for accelerated dispossession, displacement, and massward upward distributions of wealth to the already wealthy. And when we think about cities, we're also thinking about living in cities and moving in cities. And particularly in terms of mobility, before the pandemic, the lowest paid workers, especially women of color, disabled people, particularly disabled people of color in the workforce, already experienced or faced rather severe housing affordability constraints, which translated to longer work commutes. And these particular groups are already less able to work jobs that can be done remotely. So I think that's one inequity that's going to persist. What do I believe that will change? I mean, so I'm going to clarify, I don't think we're ever going to be in a post-pandemic world. What will change? I think there's possibly going to be changes in the age and income distribution among city residents, and it's going to be highly contingent on the city you're interested in. But I think there's going to be broader implications for care work and service sector employment. And more particularly amid this pandemic, While not everyone who contracts this virus dies, most people who recover have long-term comorbidities associated with exposure or infection with this virus. So what we're probably going to see is in 5, 10, 15 years, we're going to see much more need for care work, much more need for healthcare. And this is also in the context in the US anyway, an already worsening shortage of healthcare workers, which is accelerated by this pandemic, which killed, last check, about 700 healthcare workers, mostly nurses. So we're going to see more need for healthcare, more shortages in healthcare, probably greater reliance on the lowest paid and least protected healthcare workers, which we're already seeing now, particularly in nursing homes, and which have accounted for almost half of COVID-related deaths in the US. So I think really it's going to be about the nature, the age and population age and income distribution, but also increased reliance on care work. And we know that like work in that sector is not well compensated. Workers in that sector are not well protected. In fact, right now in the middle of the pandemic, these workers are the least likely to have personal protective equipment, less likely to have insurance coverage, and so forth. So like they're also being disproportionately affected by the pandemic, as well as the people that they're supposed to serve or care for. So I think that's it for me.
Thank you. Okay, our final panelist, Sarah Williams.
Hi, everyone. First, I just want to say how excited I am to be with everyone today. It's a great group of people from all over the world. So thank you for bringing us together to talk about this important issue. So I think what's not going to change in the post-pandemic city? I think it's our love for living in cities. I think, there's been a lot of discussion about the rapid movement to the suburbs or rapid movement to the countryside. And certainly that exists. I'm in New York City right now. Across the street, when I look across the street, all of the apartments are empty. And certainly there has been a mass exodus, but I think that will be a temporary kind of factor. I think we love living in cities. We love the density it provides. I think that the urban amenities kind of component that I heard mentioned earlier, or the urban amenities premium, is important to us. And cities have survived for hundreds and thousands of years for those exact benefits. And so I think that we will have a shift in who's in the cities and who's not. We might have a younger city coming back. But the advantage of the city life is something that I think will exist long after our pandemic. What do I think will change? I think that, there's been radical changes in the way that we use our street, and transportation. And I think that's a really exciting moment in terms of we're using them, we're sharing them with restaurants, we're sharing them with micromobility. We're using them not just for transport, but for really the urban public realm. And I think where this becomes really important is how we can address those communities that don't have park spaces, who don't have access to some of these features. And if we can take that energy of using the streets and translate it to those neighborhoods and communities that need more access to parks and open spaces and places to come together, it's really important. However, I think it's really critical that we state that we want to address it for that way, or else it will become and continue to be something that's an advantage that rich or wealthy neighborhoods take from the pandemic and are not provided equally across the city. So I was really interested in Ariana's comments in that, we can't forget, some of the benefits that we're seeing are benefits only to certain groups, but could be benefits for larger sociodemographic populations, as long as we put them first. And I think we have to remember, and I hope that's another thing that's a positive change, is remembering to put those on the margin first in our planning of cities. Thank you, and I look forward to chatting with everybody about their answers.
Thank you very much, Sarah. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen now, and then I'm going to let the panelists reflect on what they've heard. And I'm going to cycle back to Dan first. Anything you picked up? One thing I noticed is that there doesn't seem to be a strong feeling that we're going to see a big city exodus, which I find sort of interesting. But
yeah, I think the best that in the U.S. that I've seen is a Zillow study, and a real estate person says where things should show up first is in housing prices. And Zillow did this very good analysis that looked at low density counties and high density counties. And other than, the media is dominated by New York City and the coasts. And other than those two big cities, really, there's no evidence that inventories spiked more in central cities. And in fact, inventories are tight both in central cities and suburbs. So we're really not seeing that except in those cities. And those cities have lots of really wealthy people who can move very quickly and very easily. That's not true in the vast majority of cities. The other thing that I'd mention is I really liked how people talked policy. They didn't oftentimes it was about choices. Too many times I hear, again, dealing with real estate a lot, is what the market will do. And all of these things are policy contingent wherever you are. And I worry as much about, most people talked about opportunities, which is great. I worry about the downsides. One of the things that happened when kind of the planning and housing movement was birthed in the US around the turn of the 20th century was, in fact, it came out of public health. Jacob Riis and Lawrence Baylor, they were concerned about congestion and disease. They were concerned about that, and it led to basically a concern about concentration of poverty, about density, and a move to really, it really birthed and supported the single family zoning ideal. And as it did good things, but it also did some bad things. And I worry about kind of small things like suburbs using public health as a reason to clamp down on how many people can live on density, how many people can live in a unit. We already know that they use occupancy laws to exclude immigrants from communities. So I worry a lot about how pandemic, and my wife's a infectious disease doc, so she when she saw the title, she said post-pandemic. she said no, pandemic. So I definitely, from her, I agree that this is something we're going to be living with, and I worry about people favoring the suburban ideal in policy and planning, and what that does particularly to low-income folks and housing affordability.
Yeah, those are really nice points. Charlotte. Oh, you're on mute.
So the good thing about sitting in a panel with a lot of smart people is that you can say, well, I echo what everyone else says. So, but one thing that we haven't maybe said so far is that I think the way that cities respond to the pandemic, we've talked about planning, we've talked about policies. I think cities that are smart and come up with good policies and good planning based on this also can have a comparative advantage in the future, that people in general will want to move to such a city compared to a city that do not respond to challenge like this. So if cities are really in the forefront here and use that, I think that can become a comparative edge onwards.
Yeah. Harvey, what do you think?
Well, I want to get back to what I think Dan was saying about policy. I think really what we do right now depends upon policy choices. I think that's critical because we have these countervailing forces I mentioned in my my presentation. Now, Sarah mentioned about like streets being reused for restaurants and for micromobility. Yeah, maybe in New York City and maybe in London, but not my city. My city has basically kept things business as usual, unfortunately. And I think we're missing a big opportunity. This is like one of those policy windows that opened up and we're not going through it. And therefore I'm not seeing a reconfiguration of street space here. And I think that, that's true of a lot of cities. I think the success stories you hear, like in Bloomberg cities and so forth, and City Lab, I think are the exemplars and not what's happening in a lot of places. And I'm afraid we're going to miss an opportunity to really transform our cities. The other thing I worry about is whether cities will be cash strapped in the future. What's going to happen with that? I mean, whether they can afford to make some of these policy and infrastructure investments we're calling for. In my city, Columbus, Ohio, is heavily dependent upon income tax. And right now, everyone's working at home, and a lot of people who used to work in the city center are now working out in the suburbs. And when Ohio, no longer has a financial emergency, those suburbs are going to try to grab that wage tax. And suddenly, because people are going to pay taxes where they work, and that may be a massive shift of funding from the city to the suburbs. So yeah, I think that's a big consideration. We have a lot of things to spend money on, and there's going to be a shift in some city revenues.
Sounds good. Max is the next person to speak, but I've been prompted by Levi to remind the audience that we'd love to see some questions from you, and you can submit those on the Q&A tab. It should be at the bottom of your screen. All right, Max.
So I was really struck by the fact that no one is calling no one is sort of calling it for big cities, right? So I wanted to try and put the case against. I mean, if you haven't read it, you should have a look at this paper by Matt Clancy called "The Case for Remote Work," which is a really well put kind of case for the prosecution on this. I mean, broadly speaking, we don't have a lot of hard evidence on this, but it's not clear that existing teams are any less productive when they work at home. It's certainly cheaper for employers, and the better the tech and kind of platforms like Indeed become, the easier it is to kind of put together and source teams across distance. So a lot of the kind of arguments that are made about labor markets in cities can increasingly be made about organizing online. So the most aggressive version of that case is to say, look, we've been in a kind of we've been in an equilibrium, which is the result of path dependence and lack of information about what we can actually do. And we've now been forced into a situation where we've discovered that, at least for some people, some of the time, this stuff works, and it's a manageable shift. Now there's a whole set of issues and pushback on that, so I want to acknowledge that, but that kind of argument, particularly when it's sort of seen by people who run organizations and are in a process to decide how workforce is organized, is going to have some real world impacts, I think. Now, it's not clear to me that we actually know whether this stuff works and who it works for and under what conditions. So we're going to see a lot of very kind of noisy learning, to use the econ jargon, in the next few years as we try and figure this stuff out. But I think it's really important to put that case, because we're already in a world in which some of these adjustments are starting to happen or starting to be considered for at least some of the workforce.
Yeah, I mean, I would be really curious, and I'm not going to, but this is something to stick in your heads that I hadn't really thought of. But what about whether or not this works, especially for women? Because it certainly seems to me that we might be seeing evidence that, yeah, this works and we can work at home, but that this does not work particularly for women who are married and have children at all. So I guess I would query whether that works. But next I'm going to move on to Sue.
Well, you can query whether it works for women, but you can certainly query whether it works and know that it doesn't for cities that don't have regular power supplies. And even for the middle classes that don't have regular power supplies. And I actually did want to make a more general point about a cautionary, if you like, is that we need to be really careful when we talk that we don't essentialize from the experiences of one or two lead cities. And yes, the future of big cities and of primary cities and countries is absolutely key. But if you take a continent like Africa or Asia, most of Asia, Actually, most people live in small cities. And from that, I think you want to go back and you want to say, well, so what are we actually then tracking? And if you're thinking about a discussion like this as being really important for us to be thinking about, what is it that we should be tracking? When we think about kind of monitoring, if you like, or engaging with the post-pandemic city, what do we need to have our eye on? And it seems to me that the point that a number of panelists have made is that maybe it's not just this pandemic, but it's other pandemics too. And some of them are already existing. So, they're road accidents, they're tuberculosis, they aren't all infectious diseases. So when we begin to start to think about kind of what's there and how do we think about its impact on the city, we need to have a much wider kind of remit on that. And so it's in that context that, for me, one of the things that we need to be thinking about is that I think that what will change in cities may turn out to be the things which are already implicit in the Sustainable Development Goals, which are the things about what goes on in places, in cities, that affects the entire global population. Because perhaps the most important thing that COVID has done is that it's demonstrated to us that it doesn't matter if you live on the Upper East Side in a really, really wealthy apartment overlooking Central Park. If somebody has got a chicken or a pangolin or whatever it is that it actually has not been effectively regulated and doesn't have access to appropriate healthcare, you and they are in exactly the same set of exposures. And so I think one of the things which is going to begin to start shifting is that we may actually begin to define universal basics on things like access to water and sanitation and appropriately regulated markets. And it may not be digital work and work that should be our only focus when we start to think about the post-pandemic city. So I'd like us to widen the way that we think about that.
Thank you. Ariana. And you're still muted. Okay.
Yeah, for some reason my space bar doesn't work for unmuting myself. I guess I wanted to revisit a couple of points. It'll be very brief. The first was that when I'm thinking about mobility, I'm not just thinking about, whether we're riding bikes, buses, or using our car. I'm also thinking about the right to space. I don't think race has been brought up yet, racism particularly. So the construction of urban space, the creation and maintenance of urban space is a highly racialized project. And I'm speaking more specifically about US context, but this is undoubtedly true in European cities as well, where immigrants are subject to racialized policing practices that delineate which kind of spaces are considered, which kind of spaces are effectively public for white people, but kind of contingent in requiring more care in terms of navigating those spaces for people who are not white. Particularly in the US, amid we're having this whole movement, Black Lives Matter, calls for defunding the police. It's really important to also think about the central role of policing for the creation of urban space. Policing is central for evicting people who are precariously housed, people who are already facing affordability constraints within the cities. Policing is also essential for enforcing the gentrification of neighborhoods. And this is what we saw when Breonna Taylor was killed by police in Louisville, Kentucky. In a neighborhood, the majority Black neighborhood, that's historically Black neighborhood she lived in, it has also been a subject of intense interest for developers. And with that, historically, it's also intense police presence. And we can think of this also as a public health crisis. For example, in New York City, NYPD did not mandate wearing masks, despite having massive outbreaks in March and April. And only this week have they mandated wearing masks, but they've continued the racist policing practices such as stop and frisk, where they've disproportionately exposed Black and Latinx people in the city. And in that way, again, this is kind of going back to the point of racialized production of space. Because cities are, so in that way, we can think about policing as central to displacement, dispossession of people through eviction, for example. Also, the creation of space, defining who belongs in what spaces. And I can't remember the last point, but it's all affect, like in the broader sense, like when we're talking about cities as places, we also need to be a little bit more cognizant of race.
Yeah, I think that's a very good point. Sarah.
I feel very fortunate that I get to go last here because there's so many exciting comments. I think one thing I wanted to bring up that kind of struck as I was listening to you is this idea of the CBD. And while I think that we will definitely still love cities and come back to cities, I do think the CBD will be re-envisioned in a way. And I don't think that, to get back to and relate that to some other comments that we have had, I don't think everybody wants to work at home, certainly. Like, in fact, I have a friend who works for the Wall Street Journal, and they just did a survey, like how many people want to come back to work, and it was 65% want to come back. And I think that has a large part to do with, like, I know at home trying to manage their job, their life, their household, their children's education, and all of this. And I think that there is still a huge benefit for being in the workplace and working together. But I do think this ability to be more mobile will certainly change the way that central business districts work and operate. And I think that we will, what that will be, I think, is really something we need to start considering now, because cities will lose a huge tax base as these are going. And I have friends in New York that run companies that have closed their leases, abandoned their leases. So this is a big deal. It's one of the reasons that New York City is $88 billion in debt. And so it will be something that urban planners really, really need to consider. I think related to that, time and space has been folded, right? Like, we can be with anyone. I mean, I think how incredible it is that I'm on a classroom with people in Japan and California and Africa all at the same time. And there's a lot of advantages to that folding, which allows, let's say, previous communities that didn't have access to, let's say, the global marketplace to have that access, but as long as they have the infrastructure to do it. So that gets back to Susan's point about the need for some equity in infrastructure, and particularly, just access to basic internet and consistent internet in many global cities doesn't exist, particularly in the global South. And so, while it provides greater access to those communities to the global marketplace, if their city or community doesn't have the infrastructure, it can leave them very far behind. But I mean, I've been thinking about this a lot. I've been working in Nairobi and Kibera, actually putting up wireless hotspots during the pandemic and helping to organize in that way. And the community that I've been working with, Kibera, has like switched to digital really quickly and has been able to but these are, let's say, community groups within Kibera. But I think we will, if we provide greater access to the internet, we can equalize some of those differences.
I'm getting messages from Levi that we have lots of Q&A questions, and we'd also prepared a lot of questions. So I think what I should do is probably turn it over to Levi to make sure that some of the audience questions can be handled. But I can say to the audience and the panelists, the questions that we were thinking we would be interested in case you're able to sort of wrap your answers into more than one topic, were about sort of household structures and household change, how we think about public transportation infrastructure and how that's going to be provided, what we think about housing markets, what we think about the equity question. And I suspect that a lot of the audience members have very similar questions. So I think what I'll do is turn it over to you, Levi.
Wonderful, thank you. So I really appreciate everybody who's sending in questions here. I think that sort of the longest standing point of inquiry from the people attending is on kind of this question about decentralization and the shift in actual sort of structure. You know, are we changing from having one central business district to having a bunch of sort of decentralized community areas? And if so, does that sort of reverse the trend of sort of the breakdown in civic community and sort of the little platoons that are the bedrock of community? So I guess the best frame, I think, is James Milne's question, which Harvey has already answered in the chat. If work becomes more remote and less social, will we see people's social needs being met more outside of work? And will people who want to access services more locally? Will fewer CBDs and small neighborhood centers be good for people? Does anybody on the panel have?
Yeah, if I can jump in real quickly, we have to remember that CBDs are a relatively new invention in urban history. And there were ceremonial centers to cities, but in terms of a centralized business district, that didn't happen until the telegraph and the elevator was invented. So actually, we'd be going back to the way cities used to be before the 19th century if CBDs become diminished.
Yeah, I wonder, Charlotta and Max, if you have opinions on this from in terms of sort of composition, because part of it is about the distribution of people within a city, right? What kinds of people we have. But maybe Charlotta and then Max.
So I think I'm going to pass on this one because I have to think about it a bit. I haven't thought of this really, so I pass it to Max.
Excellent. Well, look, I mean, I'm gonna come at this from a very sort of economistic viewpoint. So I want to start by thinking about, you know, changes in office work. Now, as various people have said, you know, like in almost every country in the world, I think apart from like Luxembourg in the study that I'm thinking of, you know, majority of jobs can't be done from home. So the channel that we're thinking about here is basically, you know, a big enough share of office work triggering, you know, second order effects in the kind of lunchtime and evening economy around offices. And that's a very crude way of thinking about it and the kind of ripple effects of that. So when we think about office work, I mean, it's, you know, there's been this big shock, firms are adjusting, the market's going to adjust after that. And it's really not clear, I think, which way it's going to go. I mean, the sort of survey evidence that people have been talking about and that I've, you know, that I've been looking at with kind of co-authors is all over the place. And I think that speaks to a lot of confusion, you know, inside organizations about where we're going to end up. You could well imagine a scenario where we end up with, you know, a lot less demand for office space in cities because most office workers are working at home most of the time. But you could also imagine a scenario, you know, particularly if the virus stays endemic, when we end up with higher demand for office space, because, you know, at least some of the workforce are going to have to be in the office at least some of the time under distancing, alongside some people who are going to have to be in the whole time. And it could go either way. And then there's also a geography of that. So, you know, cities like London, you know, might come out quite well out of that process. Smaller cities might come out less well, or it could flip around. I mean, it could be, if this is more driven by housing market decisions, then, you know, maybe we're going to see more sort of polycentricity out of that. But it's really, really hard to call it. And then, you know, there are other parts of that about the way housing markets might go and the way that local services might go. And the issue there is, you know, whether stuff that was kind of bought and consumed in city centres is going to shift one-to-one to suburban neighbourhoods, or whether we're going to buy this stuff online instead. And I'm kind of wary of generalising from the UK case because it's a real outlier in terms of, you know, the kind of embrace of buying things online. But that also suggests that these, you know, these things may work out differently in different countries because of paths that we've been on and kind of preferences and, like various people have said, policy decisions. So, you know, we're in a situation in the UK where, you know, the government is making policy decisions that will, you know, render some work unviable, where it may not actually be unviable. But if we kind of take support away from sectors of the economy and those sectors collapse, it's hard to bring them back again. So, you know, policy is also in the mix here, I think.
Wonderful, thanks. Would anybody else on the panel like to address
Yeah,
that question?
if I can add, I think the on the one hand, but on the other hand is exactly right. I mean, I was going to make the same comment about needing more space in offices, but I think what may happen, and I've talked to a few corporate real estate folks in the States, is at least in the States, is the value of office space may decline because you can only pay so much for your overhead as a company before you really threaten your competitiveness. And if you need more space per worker, you just may not be able to pay as much. And what that could do is actually free up some space, lower the price of land and enable more housing in central cities because they often get priced out by office space. The other thing that I'd piggyback on Harvey's comment is, yes, CBDs were kind of this modern city invention at some degree, but cities that boomed and really grew a lot after World War II often really don't have significant CBDs, or at least they're not. I mean, Atlanta is not only not monocentric, it's not polycentric. It's just a mess. So even if we lose office jobs everywhere, they will be distributed over lots of different places. And you know, again, the coastal bias and particularly the New York City bias, a lot of cities in the US are like Atlanta, like Dallas, like these, you know, like Denver. A lot of cities are these, you know, if you look at Shlomo Angel's maps of commuting patterns out of NYU, they're just nothing. I mean, there just are not job centers to speak of, or they're very small. So, you know, yes, I think downtown Atlanta will have some issues, but downtown Atlanta is not a huge share of anything. And that's true for a lot of cities, that really the edge cities and whatever we call them, those peripheral cities, those peripheral office complexes are where a lot of office jobs are.
Wonderful, thanks. And then Charlotte, did you have anything to add? Or?
Yeah, I agree that this may have be sort of reflected on the like what nation you're in and what kind of city size we're talking about. But unlike the US, I would say from a Swedish perspective, even the tiniest city has some kind of city center still. And what I could see sort of shift during the pandemic in this place, at least, was that we suddenly start to value the local neighborhood way more than what we have done in the past. And you would see people go out and eat in the local restaurant. They would post on Facebook, they would post on Instagram, support your local, just to keep the local community alive as much as possible when it was being under threat. So I can sort of see that may also stay for some time after this pandemic, that you actually value what you have nearby more than what we have done in the past.
Levi, can I just add briefly onto that?
Yes, of course.
I mean, I think, colleagues, just to be clear, I think that one of the things we may want to watch is that the very nature of work may change and the nature of the workplace may change. So if you begin to start thinking about a city like Lagos or Kinshasa, where technically, you know, actually 80% of people are not employed in formal work, the nature of these impacts is going to shift really, really dramatically. And in fact, what we may be seeing is that actually those places are ahead of the curve, not behind the curve. And we want to understand some of those kinds of dynamics much, much more than we currently do. So I would argue that that's the first point that we need to do. And then secondly, I think we have to be really careful about what's the causal factor here. And whether we actually make individual choices about where we will and where we won't work. Because everything about how cities are run historically teaches us that where the boundary is, how the rates and taxes are drawn, has to do with elite interests. And I really think one of the things we've got to go back to is to begin to re-understand those regimes of power and finance will change, but they will not stop being regimes of power and financial decision-making. And so that would be the thing I would argue in this, is that I think, you know, who actually eventually wins the battle of where we work and what gets taxed and which city or boundary it falls into is probably not going to be the person who's at a manual 9-to-5 job at the moment.
That kind of leads pretty nicely into the next question that I'd like to move to, if everybody's okay with that. In the Q&A, Deanna Mills has asked, Ariana mentioned an increasing need for work post-pandemic, or care work post-pandemic, sorry. Do you believe that the pandemic will raise awareness of valuing the importance of certain types of jobs like caregiving? Could this lead to a pay rise for caregivers? And more generally, adding to the question, not all jobs can be done remotely, and not all jobs can be done in suburbs. Right. So what does the pandemic do to the different kinds of workers, and how are those impacts different for different sort of social or job related groups? Ariana, if you'd like to take it first.
Okay. Care work. Awareness of care work, I think, is still going to be kind of stratified. A lot of times people don't become aware of the importance of care work, undervalued care work until they need it. And that's often cut across gender lines as well. But what the implicit question of whether that awareness would translate to policies that would increase the wages of these workers, I think that's going to be highly contingent on the policy environment of the given place you're interested in. And in the U.S., care workers, like particularly child care workers, are paid very little and have very few protections. Care workers in healthcare, particularly like community health workers and nurses or nurse assistants in long-term care facilities and so forth, they are also paid very little. Approximately about half of them make a little less than $15 an hour, and very few have they're much less likely to have health insurance coverage, much less likely to have paid days off. So like these lack of protections and low wages means that they're still going to be they're among the most precarious, while also working with the most precarious in society. And in the middle of a pandemic, that has like reverberating effects. Because, like, for example, I think I mentioned earlier, nursing homes in the U.S., residents in nursing homes account for nearly half of, at least last tally I saw was 43% of death, COVID attributed death. In terms of what work can be done, there was a recent study by an economist, this is in the US context, that found that only about 37% of jobs could be done remotely. And in terms of who can work remotely, that's also stratified geographically. And you can think of it also in terms of who has access to broadband. Broadband access is best in metro areas and suburbs compared with rural areas. And you also see accordingly the distribution of jobs that can be done remotely is highly concentrated in urban and suburban areas. But we can't forget that within cities, there's quite a few people who can't do their work remotely. And the people who are least able to work remotely are Black, Latinx, immigrants, while the people who are most able to work remotely are generally white. And across to like professional or occupational strata, you see a lot more white collar workers in finance, tech, and certain sectors of healthcare that are able to work remotely, while most people outside of those sectors have to go into work, even in the middle of a pandemic. Anyone else want to address that? Any other question?
Would anybody else like to speak to the changing nature of work and how the pandemic affects people differently based on what they do?
That's very much the picture in the UK as well. It's really striking hearing Ariana talk that through. All of those kind of stylized facts, apply in a kind of UK version. So that combination of physical and financial vulnerability is a really important part of the story. And we know from work that the UK Office of National Statistics has done that Black and minority ethnic groups are more likely to be in that intersection of vulnerabilities. I mean, on the kind of care homes point, one of the issues we've had in this country has been care home workers being, insecurely and insecurely contracted and low paid, to the extent that they're taking multiple jobs in multiple care homes, and this has become a channel for spreading the virus around. So, from a kind of public health efficiency point of view, let alone from an equity point of view, there's clearly a strong case for, not only kind of valuing this stuff more in terms of kind of profile and awareness, but paying people more so that those kind of labor market structures alter and we decrease risks to everybody, including the workers themselves.
But I just ask though, I mean, do we think that we're going to see changes? So agreed, we probably will never live in an entirely post-pandemic world. But do we see things just getting worse for these workers? Do we see any improvements? What do we, looking forward in a crystal ball, what would all of you say about what you think is going to happen?
I'd be more worried about automation than I am about COVID in terms of some of the shifts in labor and vulnerabilities we're going to see as jobs are replaced. I think that's a major concern over the long run. In the short run, I want to echo what other people have said. We looked at public transit decline across the United States. We have a study; it's just about to be published, and the people who were left, quote unquote, on public transit during the lockdown period were basically, women, African Americans, older people, people from less affluent neighborhoods, and so forth. So there is a vulnerability there that they're exposed to, and they're kind of hidden to us, all of us who are hiding at home and interacting with people on Zoom. But when you look at what's happening now, and the people who have to travel, and especially people for essential jobs, especially people who depend upon public transit, it's very different than the rest of the population, and they're vulnerable to these exposures to the pandemic and so forth. It also shows you we need to invest in that type of, we spend too much of our resources and space in getting people from the suburbs to the city center in their private cars. When we think about what's core in an economy, the essential work where people must travel, that's a very different travel pattern. And that's what we should be investing in to make our cities more resilient.
Yeah. Rachel, can I come in on this? Because I think one of the things for me, which is really interesting, is to watch the nature of the discussion in forums like the G20's Urban Group or C40 or the United Councils of Local Government. And for me, what's really interesting is when we talk about the shift of ideas of what's going to happen in cities, some of the opportunity is about who takes that opportunity. And if you look at the kind of the early adapters to the argument that there must be change in cities, it's come from the green economy people, okay, where the post-COVID economy is going to be a green comeback. That's the one. And it's come from the infrastructure people. Okay, so transportation in particular. The people who've been really quite slow and inarticulate are the people who would argue for social protection and improved social protection. And some of that is because we've been very bad at making the case for city scale social protection. And so it seems to me that some of what we need to begin to think about when we think about will workers and will households be better or worse off in a post-pandemic city around things like their social protection is, are we pressurizing our city councils to have rebates on energy if you are working from home? Are there rebates for people who've lost their jobs for a temporary period? There's lots of discussion about furloughs, but I've seen very, very little at the city scale. And it seems to me that it's that kind of discussion that will determine in practice what actually happens to households at scale. And so the social protection people really need to wake up and come to the party, not because climate is not important, but because if you go down the route of a conventional green economy strategy on climate change, you land up with a very energy infrastructure heavy agenda, and you actually ignore many of the really important social questions.
So if I may just add to the discussion, I think even though we've all been afraid of the virus, we've been afraid of the pandemic, my biggest fear in relation to this crisis is what's going to happen to the economy in the end. And the response to the pandemic and how that will affect all of our economies negatively, because I think if it really goes down, the people that are going to be hit the hardest will be the marginalized groups, the vulnerable that we're talking about here. So I think the way we respond to the pandemic should be discussed, well, not maybe in this context, but in general, way more, because I think the consequences of that will be way more far-reaching than the consequences that comes directly from the pandemic.
If I may, there's an excellent piece in the Washington Post today that talks about the US response and how it really has disproportionately benefited capital at the expense of workers, at the expense of housing for workers. And I think it's so emblematic of how we responded to crises in the past that this one has even been worse, meaning the response during the Great Recession definitely helped capital. This one was more explicitly focused on capital. It was more explicitly has ignored the basic needs of folks, has completely ignored renters, essentially. And whatever response we get has to be assumed to be some kind of trickle-down response in the US. And it's just, having lived through and worked through the last crisis, it's incredibly depressing to see the response this time be much worse in terms of its effect on inequality and its really lack of response to inequality. I mean, the latest estimate is 35 billion in rent arrearage across the country. We've done nothing about that. And that is predominantly Black and Latinx households. And $1,200 checks and temporary boost in unemployment, that was really the only good thing that we've done. Yet basically giving grants to any business that wanted it, it's just really been more absurd than anything else. I just have to, since we brought up inequality, this has had tremendous response, and it sets the groundwork for the next response. We've got to just totally rethink how we did this, at least in the US.
Would anybody else like to jump in on the sort of idea of the prediction and the future theme there? No? Okay. So we have about time for one more question. I should just say, there are so many good questions in the Q&A that I think we could probably be here for many, many hours answering all of them. So I really want to commend the level of sophistication from the audience here on the submissions. And going, I think, with one of the higher voted new questions is about the data in spatial analytics and data. How will COVID change these sort of large urban data collection enterprises? And how will urban research measure cities differently or not because of COVID in the future? You may be familiar with things like contact tracing applications and sort of the different privacy implications there, or the recent issue in the UK managing data in Excel spreadsheets with row limitations that have resulted in massive undercounting in the last few days of the pandemic. So how does the data about cities change going forward?
I'll try to take a start at that. I think that one thing that COVID hopefully exposed is the missing data, as I would say. And in that, what I mean is that there is a lot of data that we're not collecting that has an effect on how we can address policy concerns. So at least in the US, there's just huge holes in, let's say, race of COVID patients, huge holes in how that data is collected. I mean, for a large part, the COVID data is being collected by like Johns Hopkins and like cobbled together from different states, which also creates, huge holes in kind of who's counted and who's not. And so I hope that we can take this moment, in the era of big data, when we say like there's trillions of data in the world and we can answer every question that's possible, that we actually take a step back and say like, wait, there are huge holes in our data sets, whether they are, data feeds from Google or from our social media, and that those huge holes often represent those on the margins and have a huge effect on how we make decisions in the city. So maybe what I hope for is through exposing that, we kind of change some of our systems. In relation to contact tracing, I just think it's so interesting. I was teaching a data ethics class at the end of last semester. So right during COVID lockdown and everything. And we spent a lot of time talking about and debating COVID tracing apps and looking at how different countries use their data to do that. And, our data privacy laws, both in the UK and US, basically, make those apps impossible, but they are something that happens in Asia. And like we have that big example in Taiwan of, basically them responding completely to the pandemic through a complete surveillance like application. And I think there's some medium ground that we're not taking advantage of in that, right? And that there are huge privacy concerns and we really need to address them. But there are also ways that we can use cell phone data and other kinds of mobility data to understand the potential contagion, and that's useful. But we're having trouble navigating, and I think that's a problem that we have for all data in cities. How do we navigate the huge privacy concerns and the potential good and harm that one data analysis can do? I could talk about this for 2 or 3 hours, so I'm going to stop myself and let other panelists jump in, but I think it's a super interesting question, and thanks so much for bringing it up.
Would anybody else like to speak to how our representations of cities or data about cities will change?
Yeah, so as somebody who does no work on data, I would argue that, it's been horrifying living in the UK and realizing how bad the data systems are, and transparently how bad they are in other incredibly affluent countries. But they can be fixed here and can be fixed quite easily. It's a much, much more complicated problem to fix them in very poorly resourced and under-enumerated parts of the world. And if we are interested in pandemics and infectious diseases, it doesn't matter how much you refine the systems of rich places if you have no mechanisms for understanding what's going on in poor places and then linking that information into a single system of information and dissemination and action. Actually, we're nowhere. And so I would argue that more than ever, the multilateral system actually is really quite fundamental, and fundamental at the urban scale and with respect to data. And the sooner we actually begin to engage those questions really head on, otherwise we actually are going to be in the stew when we get a pandemic that may in fact be more infectious than this one.
So, even though we normally have access to great microdata in Sweden, I think we probably have some of the best data sets in the world to work with. Data related to the pandemic has been very hard to find. But one thing that sort of struck me, because I've been working part-time in Canada for many years and also in Sweden, so I still collaborate with people over there. So we've been trying to just compare what's going on in the two countries, and you realize how little comparable data there is even across countries. Not even having to bring it down to a regional level, like not even a death is a death related to COVID, but sometimes it's from COVID or it's with COVID, or so it's so hard to compare anything, I feel like, during the pandemic. And I would love to have seen more comparable data, both at the regional level, but also at the national level, so that we can learn from one another.
one of my fears about all this is it's not specific to COVID pandemic, but just with smart cities and urban data overall, is that yes, this data has been a revolution, but a lot of it's low hanging fruit, just easily quantified and measured stuff. And how do we get at some of the real thorny issues, and also, make sure we're capturing people who are marginalized and disadvantaged within our cities? How do you measure something like sustainability or resilience of different neighborhoods? I mean, again, we can use the easy measures and the available cell phone data, which I'm in favor of. I use it quite a bit, but I always worry that we're just like the drunk looking under the street light for the keys, not because they're there, just because the light's good. And I kind of worry about that with a lot of our data infrastructure we're building in cities right now. We're just throwing light on things we've thrown light on before, and other things are still in the darkness.
And we haven't done a good job collecting new public data. I mean, that's at least in the US. I mean, we're moving in the opposite direction currently with the decennial census. It's looking very bad. We have all kinds of threats to decent, regular American Community Survey data, and we're reliant on big data, which is mostly proprietary or private data. Often really questionable data. That I review so many studies with big data that I really don't feel comfortable with. And then the good data is often proprietary, at least especially on the real estate side and the housing side. You have to have, lots of money to get access to it. And just to be pessimistic again, when the foreclosure crisis hit in this country, we had a bill in 2010 called the Dodd-Frank Act that called for all kinds of new public data on people's housing, on foreclosures, on loan servicing, on small business lending. It's 10 years later and we don't have it. It just didn't happen. So it's easy to say and even to legislate that we're going to get new public data. It's another thing to make it happen. Other countries sometimes have better data infrastructures, but lots of countries don't.
And there's politics behind why that data is not collected.
Exactly.
Like we often forget, right? It's like, oh, it was an oversight, or there wasn't money to do it, or, and I think, right, missing data represents politics, right? Purposely not collecting or purposely making it something that's—
and then suppressing what they do collect, not making it public.
Would anybody else want to take that, or shall we proceed? Okay. Well, then, Rachel, if you want to take.
The first thing that I wanted to say was thank you so much to the panelists and to the audience for a panel that I advertised as going for about an hour, and now we've gone 22 minutes over, and we have so many questions we're not getting to, which I think probably all of us knew was going to happen because it's a really interesting topic and we have a great set of panelists. But thank you for everyone being such a good sport with the novelty of Zoom and my fumbling through parts of it. Thanks for taking the questions that you were able to take. Thank you so much to the audience I haven't been able to look because I've been busy doing my little keyboard thing, but it sure seems like a very robust set of questions. I'm sure the panelists are happy to take those questions via email. Certainly, I think pretty much everyone is super active on Twitter who's on this panel. So I'm sure that they would take those in a public forum as well. But yeah, and thank you to Levi for handling all these questions. I think I even texted the entire panel or audience at one point publicly. I promise to do better the next time I'm doing this. But thank you, everyone. Thank you to the audience.
Indeed. Thank you so much to everybody.
Thank you so much for
Thank
having
you.
us.
It's been great.